The cell theory. In this lesson, we'll be covering biology, cell facts, discovery of cells, Robert Hooke, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, spontaneous generation, Louis Pasteur, Matthias Sheldon, Theodore Schwann, the initial cell theory, the modern cell theory, and then two types of cells. Biology. What is biology? Well, biology is the study of life. It helps answer the questions, how do we function, and why do we act and like the things that we do? In essence, it's the science of living things. Living things, people, living things, animals, living things, plants, all these living things, that is biology. It's the study of living things. Now, some cell facts. The average human being is composed of around 100 trillion individual cells. That's a massive, massive number. If you take a look at that in number form, we're going to get 1,000, million, billion, trillion, and then of course it's 100 trillion. So we're going to add 2 zeros onto that. So we're going to have 100 trillion. So that's at 100 trillion. It's a lot of cells. There are over 200 different kinds of cells in your body. The biggest cells are nerve cells, which can be greater than a meter. It can be seen without a microscope. Every cell in your body has the exact same instructions, which is pretty amazing considering the difference between a brain cell and a foot cell, and yet it has the exact same set of instructions, the same blueprint. And if the DNA in a human cell were stretched out and laid end to end, it would measure approximately 2 meters. So that's one cell, 2 meters of DNA. And since we have so many cells, we get approximately 200 billion kilometers of DNA inside our 100 trillion cells, which is pretty amazing. Discovery of cells. So in 1665, English scientist Robert Hooke discovered cells while looking at a thin slice of cork. Now we understand that cells are in living things, and even without any knowledge of what cells are, you probably still have an idea that cells are what make up living things. But back in 1665, they had no idea, so they're starting from scratch. So coming up with the idea of cells while looking at a thin slice of cork from the cork tree, it's a pretty amazing thing. It's a brand new thing. So he described the cells as tiny boxes or honeycombs. He thought that cells only existed in plants and fungi because that's all that he was looking at. He wasn't looking at humans and trying to figure this out. He was looking at plants. So you can see some of his initial drawings are pretty amazing. And you can see why he might think these, right? They look like little honeycombs, little boxes inside this area. And this is while looking at cork plant. So this is his cork plant on the left. And on the right was a later drawing he did of a flea using his microscope. Anton van Leeuwenhoek. So fast forward a little bit. 1673, Anton used a handmade microscope to observe pond scum and discovered single-celled organisms. He called them animalcules. He also observed blood cells from fish, birds, frogs, dogs, and humans. Therefore, it was known that cells are found in both animals and plants. So we have Hooke discovering cells while looking at plants, while looking at cork, and then Anton comes along and says, okay, well, they're not just in cork, but they're also in animals. So we got plants and animals. So 150 to 200 year gap. So between Hooke/Leeuwenhoek's discoveries and the mid-19th century, so around 1850, very little cell advancements were made, and this is generally thought to be caused by the spontaneous generation idea. So the traditional idea that things are just materialized out of non-living things. So for instance, mice come from dirty clothes/corn husks, because of course if you have dirty clothes laying on the ground, or you have corn husks, you will generally find mice. And another one, maggots from rotting meat. So if you leave meat out rotting for a very long time, of course you'll eventually see maggots starting to form. Those are the kind of nasty little white bug-looking like things. They'll just materialize seemingly out of nowhere, out of the meat. But of course the maggots aren't created from the rotting meat. They are living things that are placed there and then they develop. Right? Same thing with the mice. Mice are attracted to these things. They don't develop from the corn husks. They're attracted to them. 19th century advancement. However, there was much doubt around the idea of spontaneous generation. It's an interesting idea. It does make sense from a certain point of view. However, it doesn't really make sense when you think about it. And this was brought up by Louis Pasteur, the same guy that learned about pasteurizing milk. He didn't really think this was a good idea. And this led to our development of the modern cell theory. So in 1838, German botanist Matthias Sheldon concluded that all plant parts are made of cells. Now, we already established that plants had cells in them, but Sheldon in 1838 discovered that all plant parts had these cells. And then 1 year later, Theodore Schwann stated that all animal tissues are composed of cells. So similarly, we already knew that animals had cells in them, but now we're going further and saying that all animal tissues are composed of cells. Development of the cell theory. 1858, we get Rudolf Virchow. After extensive study of cellular pathology, he concluded that all cells must arrive from pre-existing cells. Spontaneous generation can occur because for 2 cells to be made, there need to be an initial cell that spawned them. And then from these 2 cells, we can get 4 cells, and so on. So for a next generation of cells to be created, there needs to be a previous generation, and that's what Virchow stated. So let's take a look at our initial cell theory. So our initial cell theory had 3 basic components. First of all organisms are composed of 1 or more cells. Number 2, the cell is the basic unit of life in all living things. And number 3, all cells are produced by the division of pre-existing cells. So those are our three main ideas that we're starting with. And then from there, we were able to advance our theory. So the modern day cell theory does have many parts from it, but we've expanded it. So the basic ideas of the cell theory have withstood the test of time. However, there have been a few additions over the years as our knowledge has increased. So what is our current cell theory? Well, all organisms are composed of one or more cells. Number 2, the cell is the basic unit of life in all living things. Number 3, all cells are produced by the division of pre-existing cells. Number 4, energy flows inside cells. And number 5, cells contain DNA, which determines the organism's characteristics and is passed down from one generation to the next. And you can see what our cell looks like. So within our cell, we're going to zoom in on the nucleus. Inside our nucleus, we have our DNA. And the DNA is what makes our organism what it is. It makes a frog, a human, a tree, and so on. It's in this DNA that's written our blueprint that makes us who we are. It's the difference between us and a tree, is what's in our DNA. Now, there are two main types of cells. The first is called prokaryote cells. Prokaryotic cells have no nucleus, and they're very simple. Think things like archaea and bacteria. These are prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, contain a nucleus. They're much larger, and they're found inside more complex organisms. Things like protists, fungi, and then specifically animals and plants. And when you're thinking of complex, you think of animals and plants. So we have eukaryotic cells. We have no prokaryotic cells. We are composed completely of eukaryotic cells. So the basic idea of the cell theory is that we're able to build on our previous ideas. It wasn't something that we developed overnight. It was developed over hundreds of years. And it started at a very simple idea of the core and developed into our modern day cell theory that we have today. And that will conclude our lesson on the cell theory.